Hello, I'd like to start by thanking Ariel for inviting me to speak to you today. My apologies that this has to start via video, but I shall be joining you live before this presentation ends, and so I'm looking forward to any questions that you have. My name is Dr. Ellie Hebe, and I am the Scientific Coordinator for the ICAM Coalition. I'll be talking through some concepts of dog population management that ICAM has been working with recently. Now, I'm conscious that some of the terminology and concepts themselves might be different to those used in FORPAWS, but I am hopeful that there is plenty that you recognise and perhaps some new ideas that you will find interesting. So I'd like to cover three things today. I would like to introduce you to the ICAM Coalition and two of our guidance documents that I'll be drawing on for the rest of this presentation. In particular, the Dog Population Management or DPM guide, and that's the one that we're updating at the moment. I would like to talk you through the concept of dog population dynamics. So this is an ecological system or a model that we need to understand if we're going to design the most effective DPM system that we can. And I'll also use this concept to talk through how interventions impact population dynamics. And we have the idea of a DPM system that influences and nudges the processes within population dynamics so you can change the resulting dog population in the way that you would like. And finally, I want to talk a little about community engagement. So that's a relatively new concept in the DPM field, but I know it's something that FORPAWS is taking quite seriously. So I'd like to cover a bit about that. So ICAM was formed in 2006. We were just 5 members initially, but we are growing, not least with the addition of FORPAWS last year, which was a great contribution to our learning, but also an opportunity to share our best practice with you. And the purpose of ICAM is primarily to discuss our experiences as members, to share data and interpretation of that data, and to learn from one another. We also convene conferences to widen that learning beyond only our members and to encourage DPM science. And our next conference will be in Kenya just later this year. And we also publish guidance on companion animal management, and that's guidance based on our shared learning and our understanding of best practice. So here are 2 examples of our best known guidance, and I hope some of you will have come across these before. The first one to mention is called Are We Making a Difference? We launched this in 2015. It's a practical how-to guide on M&E, that's monitoring and evaluation, that brought together those innovations in DPM and also draws on other animal welfare fields and human development to create a best yet and foundation for further innovation and testing of M&E. Now we can view M&E as working at different levels. You can measure your outputs, for example, the number of sterilizations you perform. You can measure your outcome. So following on from the previous example, you can look at coverage of your sterilization effort by measuring the percentage of roaming dogs that are either ear-notched or tagged. And those outputs and outcomes could be termed as productivity. But then you can also measure the impact of your work. So what has changed as a result of what you and others have been doing? For example, has the density or welfare of roaming dogs changed as an impact of all your sterilisation efforts? And it's this final concept of impact that this guidance focuses on. So taking note that organisations tend to have well-established methods of measuring and recording their productivity, their outputs and outcomes, but that impact assessment is hard and it's still relatively rarely done in the field of DPM. So most of this guide is dedicated to advice on how to conduct methods of measuring indicators of impacts. So indicators are those visible and measurable signs of an impact, such as the percentage of roaming dogs with poor body condition as an indicator of the impact of improving roaming dog welfare. One method of measurement that I did want to mention specifically is street surveys, as these are turning out to be one of the most commonly implemented and maintained methods of measuring indicators over time. In the ICAM guide, we outline a particularly efficient and low-cost method, because for impact assessment, you need these methods to be repeated regularly, and this just won't happen with an involved or expensive method. Because the emphasis is on measuring change over time and in response to a DPM intervention, it's really important that everything else is kept the same. So survey a standard route at the same time of day, the same day of the week, not when the weather is bad because the dogs will hide, and ideally use the same surveyor. And then simply record every dog that you see, what type of dog it is, male, female, adult or puppy, and some visible basic welfare parameters, body condition and skin condition. Here is an example of a street survey route in Cernavodă, Romania, that ICAM supported Save the Dogs to set up. On the right, you can see the route on Google Maps. It was designed to target areas of the town known for abandonment of dogs, so-called hotspots for stray dogs. And on the left, you can see an example of the data collected on one particular street survey, with different coloured icons for the different types of dogs recorded. And this leads to some key indicators that can be used to monitor how the dog population is changing over time. Firstly, the density of roaming dogs expressed as the average number of dogs observed for each kilometre of street surveyed. Also, an indicator of welfare is the percentage of dogs that were visibly thin. An indicator of breeding activity is the percentage of females that are visibly lactating. Now, this is a particularly important or sensitive indicator because we are likely to see breeding reduced before the density of dogs changes, as a decline in the density of roaming dogs requires adult dogs to have died and not be replaced by puppies or newly abandoned dogs. Also, the breeding behaviour of dogs and the suffering and high mortality of puppies in the street are things that local people are often disturbed by. And so a reduction in lactating females may also be associated with a decline in complaints and concerns about dogs. We also have here an indicator of performance, and that's the percentage of dogs that were marked as having been sterilised. Save the Dogs repeats this survey every 3 months. It takes them about an hour to survey this route, and this allows them to evaluate how the dog population is changing in response to the different management strategies being used in this town. If you want to learn more about this method, you can look at page 69 of the ICAM M&E guide, or there is a published paper that explains more about the science behind this method and gives some examples of where it has been used. This DPN guide was our earliest publication in 2007. It aims to guide people through a process of assessing the dog population, planning a DPM intervention that suits the location, and implementing a comprehensive list of activities. Now, we're currently updating this guide and we'll be launching it at our conference in September this year. And most of the concepts I will be describing next are drawn from this update. We have pulled together 6 principles of humane DPM. That it should be humane and ethical may be obvious to us, but not to all our audiences, so that's our first principle. Our second principle is that DPM should be tailored to suit the local dog population and can't be the same in every location. There is no one-size-fits-all model. That DPM is permanent. That is a public service like fixing roads. Wherever you have dogs, you will need to manage them. So the DPM system needs to be sustained, but it also needs to be flexible and intelligent so it can adapt over time as the dog population and dog owners change with time. Our fourth principle is that we call for an evidence-based approach in both design and M&E. The fifth principle is that we encourage people to focus on root causes, not to spend all their resources and time looking only at the stray dogs of today. We also need to stem the source of the stray dogs of tomorrow. And finally, we must be aware that what people do to dogs has the greatest influence on their welfare and their population dynamics, so we must address human behaviour through our work. In this next section, I'll be looking closer at this second principle of adapting to local conditions. I'll be doing this by first describing an ecological model or system of dog population dynamics. The idea is that by understanding how dog populations work, most importantly the sources of those dogs we are concerned about, we can design DPM interventions that are maximally efficient in the long term. This is a visualization of basic dog population dynamics. It shows the different subpopulations of dogs or states, and it also shows processes. Demographic processes are part of population dynamics. They are the way dogs transition from one state to another, including birth, death, and movement out of the home, either temporarily in the form of roaming or permanently when given away, sold, or abandoned. So let's explore this visualization further by starting with just one state and building it back up again. When people think about dog population management, their minds are usually focused on these dogs, the unowned dogs on the street, the classic stray dog. But when we see a dog on a street, a stray dog, it may actually be any one of these 4 different states. So here we get to question our first assumption, that all roaming dogs are unowned, feral, or wild dogs. In fact, in most countries, most of the stray dogs, the roaming dogs, have an owner, but they're currently roaming unsupervised, and even those without a single referral household may not be entirely unowned. They may be community dogs, with more than one household offering some form of care in the form of food, shelter, or even limited veterinary care. But why do these distinctions of dog type or dog state matter? Well, for dog population management, we want to know the source of these dogs, because dog population management cannot only deal with the roaming dogs of today. That's just the symptom of our dog problem. They need to work at the root cause, or the source of these different dogs. And this is where we get to test out another assumption that often turns out to be mistaken. People may think that the principal or only source of these roaming dogs is breeding of unowned or community dogs on the streets, and that these current roaming dogs are the source of the next generation of roaming dogs. Breeding may well be happening, but it's not the only source of these dogs. In fact, because the mortality of puppies on the street can be high, the process of recruitment, as shown by these arrows, is low. Now, recruitment is the process by which puppies make it to adulthood and become part of the breeding population themselves. Breeding by unowned or community dogs may be very unsuccessful, and hence it's a minor source of the next generation of roaming dogs. And that's why sterilising just the dogs currently on the street is very unlikely to lead to extinction of the roaming dog population, although it may reduce density of roaming dogs and prevent the suffering and dying of many puppies. There will be other sources of roaming dogs in action. So what are these other sources? This is when we need to start to bring in the owned dog population more clearly. There are 3 processes that can act as sources of roaming dogs. Abandonment and unsupervised roaming of owned dogs can be very significant processes that bring dogs onto the street. Owned dogs can also be lost accidentally. And if we bring the breeding of owned dogs into the picture here, we can see how abandonment in particular can be linked to breeding in owned dogs, as unwanted puppies and pregnant females can be particularly at risk of abandonment. Note that the arrows for recruitment within the owned dog population are darker than in the unowned or community owned. This is because these dogs are like to have better access to resources and so breed more successfully. Note also that the owned roaming have the darkest arrows of all. That is because not only are they given resources by their owners, so puppy survival tends to be better, but also if they are roaming, they have a far greater chance of getting pregnant than confined owned dogs. We should also note that there are counter processes in play. Opposing abandonment, we have adoption, and to roaming, we have confinement and good resourcing by owners, meaning that dogs have less motivation to roam as their needs are met at home, and lost dogs can be reunited with their owners. Although confinement might not be required in all locations, an increase in the processes of adoption and reuniting is always desired. There are also processes between unowned and community dog states that are worth considering, in the form of communities taking on responsibility for dogs or becoming disengaged. Community dogs are likely to receive more resources from their community owners and hence have better welfare. They're also very likely to be easier to access for vaccination and sterilisation, thanks to building a better relationship with people. So the process of engaging communities to become more responsible over dogs on their streets may also be something to target through dog population management, whilst disengaging the community from their dogs should be avoided. Note that it is difficult to draw a distinct line between unowned and community dogs. They exist more on a continuum, between the extreme of a feral dog with no purposeful connection to people, through to a named and valued community dog with several households providing daily care. Dogs that have been accidentally lost and reuniting with their owners never happens will move into the state of either an unowned or community dog, dependent on how quickly they are noticed and whether they are offered care by local people. One aspect of dog population dynamics that often comes to the forefront of discussions is the role that shelters, holding facilities or rehoming centres can play. Intake to these facilities can be via catching dogs from the streets or direct relinquishment by owners. These should only provide temporary housing for dogs before they are adopted or euthanized due to ill health or behaviour problems that prevent them from being rehomed. Dogs should not be housed in shelters long term. The acquisition of owned dogs may be important to explore because dogs acquired by different processes may be at differing risks of abandonment. In particular, the purchase of dogs from pet shops and markets, whether physical or online, may involve dogs that have been bred in suboptimal conditions, such as puppy farms, leading to poorly socialised or sick puppies that may be at a greater risk of relinquishment or abandonment. Increasing adoption from rehoming centres is also a common focus for dog population management interventions where such facilities already exist. It should be noted that the purchase of dogs displayed here are from three broad sources: from homes where an owned dog has had a litter of puppies, from breeders who produce several litters per year for business purposes, and from pet shops or markets. These may well be best broken down into more detailed substates. For example, there may be specific outlets or breeders that can be identified within communities that are producing puppies that are either of particularly good or poor quality, and these would be tackled differently by a dog population management intervention. The final process that completes this basic model of dog population dynamics is death. You can see that the arrows here are of different thicknesses for different dog states, who may have different mortality risks. It should be noted that death is inevitable for all dogs, but suffering does not have to be inevitable. Humane euthanasia is an important part of dog population management, and access to vets that can perform euthanasia using humane methods will be essential for rehoming centres, owners and carers to protect dogs from suffering. So how do we gain an understanding of local dog population dynamics? Assumptions about where dogs come from are common, so we need to take some time to use both objective measures and also gather input from a range of stakeholders, rather than listen to just one person or one organisation's opinion of how dogs work. Assessment of the dog population benefits from using multiple methods. I've listed here some of the more commonly used methods, and in the photos you can see an example of a street survey being conducted in Panama and a household questionnaire being conducted in Puerto Rico. The Are We Making a Difference guide explains how you can implement each one of these different methods. These methods give us a measure of any problems experienced by or linked to the dogs, such as complaints about dogs, zoonotic disease prevalence, and welfare problems suffered by dogs on the streets and in homes. But these methods also help us to understand the processes and subpopulations involved in dog population dynamics. So what first appears to be a homogeneous group of roaming dogs, or stray dogs, starts to appear as different subpopulations, each with different processes that bring them onto the street, and different human behaviours motivations and barriers that drive those processes. And it's from this point of understanding that we're able to plan DPM for the long term. In ICAM, we have started to talk about DPM influencing and nudging those processes in dog population dynamics, and therefore changing subpopulations of dogs. And it aims to do that in a sustained way, noting that DPM is a permanent community service, but how this is done will be different between locations, and it will change over time, because dog population dynamics also changes along with changes in the wider context, not least changes in dog ownership styles and trends. So once we have an understanding of dog population dynamics, we can begin to predict how our DPM interventions will change those dogs. I'd like to use one example of a DPM activity that we all know well, and that's catch, neuter, vaccinate and return of community and unowned dogs. We can see that CNVR most strongly influences these processes of breeding by community and unowned dogs. It can also be considered an alternative to the process of catching and removing dogs from the street to a shelter. Where the local community is willing to tolerate and care for these dogs in situ on the streets, it can be considered a really good alternative. Shelters can be extremely expensive to run and can cause poor welfare for the dogs housed there, so we all know that these need to be avoided if at all possible. Looking at the whole of the dog population like this, we can also see those processes that CNVR does not necessarily influence. Roaming, abandonment, losing dogs and failing to be reunited. And of course the various sources of owned dogs, which can differ in terms of dog welfare and how likely the owner is to be happy with their dog and keep them for life. Some people are dismissive or unwelcoming of CNVR, and I think one of the challenges CNVR faces is that it's been missold and misunderstood as a standalone solution suitable for a national comprehensive approach to all DPM. However, CNVR is just one approach for delivering reproduction control, and with every other DPM service, it must be used in combination with other services to form a DPM system that influences all the dynamic processes that we see here. At ICAM, we have started framing DPM as a system, and here we have a summary visualization of that system. At the bottom here in blue, we have 4 foundations required for effective and sustained DPM. Firstly, we have legislation and enforcement of both anti-cruelty legislation as well as DPM-related laws. A task force, a multi-stakeholder group that together plan and implement DPM, rather than this falling to one department of a municipality or one NGO. Advocacy, so that people care about DPM, about doing it humanely and resourcing it for the long term. And community engagement, which I'm going to come back to again in a moment. Then in green, we have all the DPM services that can be delivered. And here we've made a distinction between those fundamental DPM services that all DPM systems need, and those services that may not be essential in all locations all the time, but are needed when the context is right. So firstly, looking at those fundamental services, behaviour change communication. We know that people influence every process in dog population dynamics. What they do matters, and there are many human behaviours that we need to encourage or discourage to be successful. Training for DPM professionals. We know DPM is a permanent challenge, and so we need local capacity to be sustainable. Reproduction control. This is where CNVR fits, but also affordable and accessible sterilisation services for owned dogs, which can be a principal source of street dogs. And veterinary care. This might be mass vaccination for rabies control, but also vet care to maintain dogs in good health throughout their lives and to end suffering humanely and promptly when treatment is no longer possible. Context-specific services are those that are going to be important in some locations, but not in all, and the timing of when they are needed is also different between locations. These include formal education of children, holding facilities and rehoming facilities, identification and registration, control of commercial breeding and sale, and managing access to resources. With support of the foundations, these DPM services together lead to positive human-dog relationships with compassionate and responsible owners and carers. And subsequently, this leads to improvement in one or more of the 8 impacts that we see at the top of the DPM system. In this final section, I wanted to spend some time talking about this particular foundation of community engagement. This is a concept that I know is relatively new to DPM, but it's being talked about with increasing frequency, and I know it's something that 4paws takes very seriously. Here is how we've defined it. Community engagement in DPM is a process of enabling conversations and building relationships between people who have a role or an interest in improving the dog situation in their community. But what does that actually mean? Firstly, what is a community? How is it defined? This can vary, but usually a community live in the same place, such as the multi-stakeholder group in this photo, who all live in a town in Bosnia and all had a stake in how dogs should be managed there. This included the local private vet, the municipality, local school teachers, farmers, hunters, and the local NGO. Or they may be defined as a community because they share a profession or they have the same socio-economic status. In this slide, I have tried to highlight some characteristics of community engagement and some actions that do not suit this approach. So firstly, community engagement encourages the community itself to be responsible. You don't tell them you can solve their problem for them, but you can offer to help set them up what will need to be a permanent community service. A community can be engaged to establish a shared perception of the dog-related problems and what success would look like if DPM worked well. This is not about you assuming you know what the goal of DPM should be. It's about asking the community what bothers them and conversely, what would make them happy. A community can themselves assess their dog population and interpret the findings to understand their own local dog population dynamics. Your assumptions about where roaming dogs come from don't help here. We need to support the community to conduct thoughtful assessments and be ready to appreciate that they know their dogs and their dog owners and carers better than you. A community needs to be engaged in planning their own DPM services. If you present them with a ready-made solution, you are unlikely to create something sustainable. The community knows their resources and what they can feasibly do for the long term. Implementation should ideally be by the community themselves, or where they have invited your outside help, they must be actively involved in making this happen, whether that be through setting up a clinic in a community space or providing post-operative care for community dogs. You can't just turn up and do it all yourself. That's a breeding ground for unsustainability and a disengaged community. Finally, the community should be the ones who evaluate if DPM has worked, what has changed, and what can be improved. We don't alone get to call our work a success and walk away. This may all seem rather time-consuming, and where you are encouraging the community to implement services themselves, you may be concerned about the quality of their work. Perhaps you feel outside experts could do it better. But community engagement can have many benefits. Here I've mentioned just a few that I've heard real-life community-based projects describe. Firstly, the interventions are more likely to be sustained. Community engagement can make communities feel responsible for DPM and justified in demanding government action in DPM, avoiding dependency on external agencies and mobilising resources such as local veterinary capacity. Community engagement can also improve effectiveness of population management because communities understand their dog population dynamics and the drivers of human behaviours relating to dogs better than outsiders do. And finally, community engagement has the opportunity to positively impact the lifetime experience and welfare of the dogs because communities are present in the long term, as opposed to the temporary interventions of outside agencies. I'd like to finish with one example of a community-based project that I was lucky enough to visit earlier this year. Manamitra, or Friend of Dog, is a DPM system based in Kathmandu in Nepal. This all started with a dog population assessment, including a street survey, household questionnaire, focus groups, and secondary sources of information. This provided some of the key results that you see displayed on this model of dog population dynamics. In summary, they found many community carers, with 40% of households saying they provided regular care to a community dog, a very high density of roaming dogs, many in a good state of welfare. Over half of the owned dogs were allowed to roam freely on the streets. Many people knew of puppies that had been born and then abandoned in their local neighbourhood within the past 12 months. And there were many dog lovers across the city. These were compassionate people that already put a lot of effort into caring for community dogs. And the city had recently devolved power to 32 local government wards. This understanding of Kathmandu's dogs and politics led Manamitra to be designed in the following way. They use CNVR for community dogs and also provide some sterilisation for owned animals. They capitalised on the ward-based structure, and in each ward they created an Animal Management Committee, the AMC. The AMC selected a team of local animal management assistants, or AMAs, including many of those dog lovers, as well as recognised community leaders. The AMAs survey and monitor their local dog population. They also actively work with the vet teams to locate, handle and care for community dogs when they are being sterilised or vaccinated. Current and future developments include passing local regulations that recognise AMCs and AMAs and provide the legal basis for government funding of their work to keep this sustained. Setting up community clinics that can provide accessible and affordable services, not least to owned dogs, which are clearly a source of current and future stray dogs. Identification and registration is envisaged for the future, once systems and owners are ready, to improve reuniting of lost dogs. And behaviour change campaigns will be used to encourage responsible ownership, potentially also utilising the AMA networks. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you found some of the concepts I shared today interesting and useful to your work. And please do take a look at the ICAN website if you want to learn more, or email me afterwards. And I'm really happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks loads for listening.